In this tutorial, we'll introduce the HoloEdit Painting Tools and how they relate to a traditional Mari painting workflow. Let's open up one of the projects we created with our import script. Typically, you might want to start with the first frames in a clip, but for this demonstration, we'll pick out a file with a little more motion. Using the Open Archive option in the project's view, navigate to the path we use for export and select the Mari _source files _ 142 to 219 MRA file. Once that's been imported, we should see it added to the projects view in Mari. Double-click on the project to open it. After opening a project created with the Mari import script, the HoloEdit Painting Tools panel will populate with a list of frames and several buttons. The Mari Tools panel lets you edit your volumetric video per frame and perform certain operations across entire segments of temporally stabilized volumetric video. Under the hood, each segment is an object in the Mari project. The Tools UI handles visibility and projection onto each object, but currently doesn't update the object selection as you select frames, so if your workflow involves multiple layers or editing nodes, you'll have to manually select the appropriate object from the object panel. Let's go over the contents of the Painting Tools window one by one. First, let's go over the frames list. This takes up the majority of the panel and contains a list of every frame within the current Mari project. Take note of the varying background color in the frames list. The background alternates between darker and lighter gray for each new stabilized segment in your volumetric clip. Because each frame within a segment shares the same topology and UV layout, certain features are only available within a current segment. You can click around the list to select different frames, including multi-frame selections via shift-click, control-click, or click and drag. Only the selected frames at any given time will be displayed in the viewport for painting. In addition to mouse controls, you can select the next frame by pressing the hotkey W and select the previous frame using the hotkey Q. If you'd like to preview your whole clip, you can press the Toggle Preview Anim button near the bottom of the panel to cycle through your clip at 30 frames a second. This can be memory intensive for Mari, so you may see lower resolution textures during playback. The frames list has a few more features, but we'll come back to those in a moment. The next feature of the HoloEdit Painting Tools is called Sequence Projection. With multiple frames selected, using typical paint buffer projection in Mari will only project onto the surface nearest to the paint buffer. Because of that, if you select multiple frames in the frames list and project onto the paint buffer, each pixel of your paint will be occluded on all but one of the frames. With the Run Sequence Projection button on the HoloEdit Painting Tools panel, your paint buffer will be individually projected onto each selected frame. This way, you can paint once and then project the paint buffer onto many frames in a single step. Simple use of sequence projection can be very useful in certain cases, like when the actor is standing very still, or in conjunction with paint buffer blend modes like Darken and Lighten for blemish removal. However, combining sequence projection with stored paint buffer transformations unlocks a much more powerful workflow. Stored paint buffer transformations allow you to store your current camera position and paint buffer transformations, scale, position, rotation, and so on, for each frame of your clip. You can store a transformation by pressing the Store Pause button on the HoloEdit Mari Tools panel, or by pressing the E hotkey. As soon as the transformation is stored, you should see the frames list update to show that the transformation is stored. Let's try adding a few stored transforms by pressing E, selecting another frame, rotating or panning the camera, and then pressing E again on each frame. To return to any of our stored transformations, use the frames list and left-click on your stored entry in the column to the right of the frames numbers. Each transformation is associated with the frame it was set on. You can also return the camera to the transformation by double-clicking on the entry in the frame column. Finally, one other way to interact with stored transformations is to press Ctrl plus Q or E to step forward or backwards on the frame, plus assume that frame's transformation. Stored transformations can be useful for keeping track of positions you like to paint on. They're especially important when combined with sequence projection. Let's select a series of frames with stored transformations and then run sequence projection to project some paint onto each frame. When sequence projection detects a stored transformation on a frame, it updates the camera and paint buffer to that stored transformation before projecting the contents of the paint buffer. Using these tools, an artist can paint once and then project that paint onto many frames from different positions and angles. This way, an artist can set up tracking of complex motion with stored transformations and then apply paint all at once. We'll demonstrate that workflow in depth later on in the series. For now, let's move on to the next major feature of the HoloEdit Mari Tools, link frames. The link frames feature connects a series of frames in one segment into a link. When paint is projected onto any linked frame, the same paint is copied onto the surface of every other frame in the link. To link frames, select 2 or more frames within a segment and press the Link Frames button near the bottom of the HoloEdit Painting Tools UI. Try with the first 5 frames, 142 to 146. In the rightmost column of the frames list, you should see a link label for the linked frames, labeled L1. Each selection is assigned a new, unique link, overriding the existing link if one is present on a selected frame. Since links can only be applied to frames within the same segment, if your selection spans multiple segments, one link will be created for each segment. Now, with frames 142 to 146 linked, if we paint anything onto frame 142 and project it with the Mari B hotkey, Mari will pause for some computation. After it's finished, we can use the Q and W keys to step through the linked frames and see that the paint we applied has been copied to each linked frame. Unlike sequence projection, this copies in texture space, so the copy is applied to the surface of the mesh rather than from a projector position. This means that within a segment, paint applied via links should follow the motion and rotation of the actor. Let's take a moment to compare these two tools head-on. We'll start on frame 147 and paint a white circle onto his hand from front view. Then select frames 147 to 151 and run sequence projection. Stepping back and forth to play through these frames, it's obvious the circle was projected from a fixed position in space. Next, let's try the same approach with a link. Select and link frames 147 to 151, and then select frame 147 and paint another circle, this time in black. Press the Mari hotkey B to project. Note that it's important to use regular paint buffer projection in conjunction with links, not sequence projection, because linked paint is applied each time you project, and sequence projection projects paint onto multiple frames. Using sequence projection will stack up multiple linked projections, taking a long time to compute, and usually producing undesired results. Now that our linked projection is complete, let's step through the frames again. Unlike our white circle, the black circle tracks the surface of the hand perfectly. Each tool has its own strengths and limitations, but generally, careful painting with links is the most productive way to edit volumetric video textures if your mesh has long, stabilized segments. Because you can only link within a segment and linking takes a little longer to apply, certain surfaces will be best painted using sequence projection instead. Continue on to the next video in this tutorial for a more in-depth demonstration on painting with the HoloEdit Mari tools.